Cannon to the left of them, cannon to the right of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Boldly they rode and well into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. One of the more famous poems to come out of the 19th century. It was written by Alfred Lord Tennyson about the charge of the Light Brigade, which comes from a war that not a lot of people talk about. And that is the Crimean War, which has some modern relevance because another recent war was fought allowing for the takeover of Crimea. So we're going to dive into Extra History's series on the Crimean War, which some people argue was a world war. It certainly was a major European war, really kind of the bridge major European war that existed between the Napoleonic Wars and World War I. So, as always, the link will be down in the description. We're going to cover 2 episodes each day. I think we'll do 2, 2, and 3 because there are 7 episodes total for this series. So, if you want to check it out without my commentary and watch the whole thing ahead of time, then come back and check this series out. That would be a great idea. Let's go ahead and dive into part 1.
Jerusalem, Good Friday, 1846. Pilgrims and priests thronged the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, eager to pray at the site of Christ's crucifixion. Now, most of the time, Holy Week falls separately on the Catholic and Orthodox religious calendars, but this year they coincide and everyone's here at once.
So, a little background. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is believed to be built not only over the site of the crucifixion, but also over the site of Jesus' tomb. There's a lot of debate about that, but it seems actually, based on the scholarship, that they're probably right in where they've got it built.
It's packed, and they're shouting. The Orthodox priests arrived first, putting their altar cloth on the altar. Then the Catholics, furious, try to yank it off and replace it with their own. Both insist they have a document from the Ottoman Sultan supporting their right, and suddenly a monk throws a punch. Within seconds, the seething crowd are shoving and kicking, smashing each other with crucifixes and candlesticks. Turkish bodyguards hired by wealthy pilgrims lay in with clubs. A priest swings an incense burner like a morning star, and people start drawing pistols.
Wow.
By the time Ottoman troops regain control,
Y'all are Christians. This is not how it's supposed to go. Just saying.
40 people are dead.
Jeez.
Welcome to the start of the First Modern War.
I had no idea that was somehow connected.
Don't forget, as soon as you're done watching this episode, episode 2 is already up a week early and ad-free over on Nebula. Stick around to the end for a teaser. The Crimean War is perhaps the most poorly named conflict in history. From its name, you might think that it was fought to settle a dispute over the Crimean Peninsula. It wasn't. Or you might assume that Crimea was the most important front of the war, but you'd be wrong again. Clashes also occurred along the Danube, in what's now Romania, in the Baltic Sea, and even in the far North Pacific. And though the land operations in Crimea are the most famous, it was the naval operations that actually won the war. In fact, historians have even proposed, mostly hypothetically mind you, that it be renamed the Baltic War, or the Great Russian War, or even World War Zero. See, the Crimean War was fought all across Europe, with Russia facing off against an allied coalition including the UK, France, and the Ottoman Empire. But it was also the first truly modern war.
Which is fascinating. It's so crazy to think how alliances can change so much because, you know, a couple of generations later, you have the real World War, World War I, as we call it, fought based on an alliance by the British, the French, and the Russians together against the Germans. Well, Germany doesn't exist yet as a unified nation. So the alliance, the whole system of alliances is different at the moment.
Conflict that began looking like the Napoleonic past, but by its end presaged the industrial slaughter of World War I. It would be the first steam-powered war, the first telegraph war, the first war with photographs and war correspondence, and it would kill at least 500,000 people. And supposedly, it all started over who got to hold a pair of keys. Now, deadly brawls at holy sites, like the one in this episode's opening, were not unusual in Ottoman-controlled Palestine. For centuries, pilgrimage sites had flip-flopped between the Catholic and Orthodox churches based on whichever faction obtained a decree from the Sultan. But in 1757, the Ottomans finally had enough and decreed a status quo, in which all 6 Christian churches would receive access to the religious sites and shared responsibility for their upkeep. And to give you an idea of how seriously—
And to give the Ottomans credit here, they could have just banned all of them, right? I mean, the Ottoman Empire is Muslim, but it is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire, in some ways similar to what you have with the Austro-Hungarians later on. So they're trying to at least be somewhat generous with all of this. And when you happen to be the empire that controls one of the holiest sites for 3 major religions, and then within Christianity you have multiple divisions. Within Islam you've got divisions. So you're dealing with a lot of different religious factions.
this is taken, get this. When the status quo was declared, it stated that nothing in a site could be changed without the churches all agreeing to it. And as you can imagine, getting full agreement proved nearly impossible. Hence, things like this happened. The day before the decree, a workman left his ladder at one of the churches, and it's been there ever since, to this day. Things became even more complicated when Catholic France, who mostly had custody of these sites via treaties, turned away from religion during the Revolutionary period.
I gotta look up this ladder. It's still there. It's called the immovable ladder on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's still there. A monument to man's stupidity and ignorance and stubbornness and inability to get along. Wow, that's cool.
And Eastern Orthodox Christians stepped in to fill the power vacuum. Then, when the French returned to Palestine in the 1830s, a series of confrontations over the sites followed. Groups warred over who would get to fix structures, since maintenance legally implied ownership. Things got tense. In 1842, the Orthodox Church erected a wall in the Church of the Nativity, blocking Catholic access to the shrine of Jesus' birthplace. 5 years later, they pried up a silver star that French Catholics had put there. But the nastiest conflict was over keys. By tradition, the Orthodox monks kept the keys to the church's front door, with the Catholics possessing a less prestigious key to an interior door. Angry at this slight, the two groups started a brawl in 1852 that killed several Orthodox monks. So in response to these worsening brawls, 2 men intervened in the conflict. Nicholas I, Tsar of Russia, and Napoleon III, recently crowned Emperor of France.
So Napoleon III is the nephew of the original Napoleon I. His son was Napoleon II. Now Napoleon III comes along. Nicholas I is Tsar of Russia in a time when Russia has kind of taken upon itself, because they share a border with the Ottoman Empire, and because of the differing religion, Eastern Orthodox in Russia, or Russian Orthodox, and then Islam in the Ottoman Empire, there have been some conflicts there, and Russia has kind of seen itself as the defender of Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and it's often been used as an excuse to go to war over territory in the Ottoman Empire, so I'm sure that has something to do with all of this.
But let's start with Nicholas I, who was largely responsible for starting the war. By 1852, Nicholas had been on the throne for 26 years and held sway over the fastest-growing empire in Europe. A military man, he grew up fascinated by his father's generals, dressed in impeccable uniforms, and slept on a cot. But perhaps Nicholas's most prominent feature was his near-religious belief in restoring the Russian Empire to its former glory. See, Nicholas believed that as the last Orthodox power, Russia was the heir of Byzantium and Rome. And as head of the Russian Orthodox Church, he considered himself the protector of Orthodox Christians worldwide, including in Ottoman territory, where they did indeed experience state-sponsored oppression and at times were massacred.
And like I said, this is an idea that has existed for some time in Russia, and how much it was really viewed as we're protecting Orthodox Christians versus this is our casus belli anytime we want to go to war with the Ottomans. It's probably a little of both.
Lily backed Christian uprisings in Ottoman territory, such as the Greek War of Independence in 1821. This belief went hand in hand with Russia's expansionist policies, which had spent nearly a century taking bites out of Ottoman territory. Though often done with the stated goal of protecting Orthodox Christians, these were also about expansion south. Catherine the Great herself started this pattern by capturing the Crimean Peninsula and its warm water port of Sevastopol. That port gave Russia a path to the Mediterranean, provided they passed through Ottoman territory. These lands were not only important for reaching ports, though. Nicholas also feared the increasing liberalism of the West, which he felt would undermine Russia's autocratic policies, and he wanted a strong Russia with buffer zones to keep the West at bay. Yeah, and if this is all sounding a bit familiar, a lot of historians have pointed out the parallels to recent events. In fact, Crimea itself, while internationally recognized as part of Ukraine, has been occupied by Russia since 2014. Actually, though, now that we're on the subject, as a quick aside, it did feel wrong to do this series without at least mentioning the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine in today's day and age. One of the saddest aspects of which has been its impact on civilians. And to that end, myself and several of our...
And we need to remember this, that anytime there's war, the ones who really pay the hardest price are the civilians. What's happening right now in the Middle East... It's the civilians who are caught in the middle on both sides. It's happening in Ukraine. It happened in every war that we've ever fought.
Our team have made donations to Doctors Without Borders, who are providing treatment to civilians within Ukraine being affected by the war, ranging from emergency medicine to psychotherapy to medical evacuation. They're also working with communities of displaced Ukrainians currently residing in neighboring countries as well. So if you'd like to chip in and you are able, we'll put a link in the description to where you can help them out with all of that. Sorry for interrupting the history. It just felt important and like it had to be done. But I digress. Russian expansion during the 18th and 19th centuries vastly weakened the Ottoman state. And to Nicholas, there was only one...
And the Ottoman Empire has been declining since its kind of heyday back in the 1700s. And this is just going to further that decline. And by the time you get into the early 20th century, they're really on their last legs.
...way it would end. During a meeting with British officials in 1844, he referred to the Ottoman Empire as a sick man, a man dying. And when that man died, he said, the powers would have to figure out what action to take. This became known as the Eastern Question. What should Europe do about the seemingly crumbling Ottomans? Nicholas wanted to partition the Ottoman Empire, or, to have Russia take it over entirely. And he saw Britain as a potential ally in this, believing that
it's not like Britain ever likes to partition things and divide them up and make decisions for groups of people that they oversee, ever.
British would be happy to see the Ottomans fall, and that after any partition, they would naturally back Russia's claim over the holy sites. I mean, the UK wouldn't side with France, right? Especially not while it's governed by Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. Though in this line of thinking, he was vastly mistaken. Turned out, Britain increasingly saw Russia as the danger, not France. Also at the time, Russia and Britain were engaged in sort of a Cold War, known as the Great Game, each trying to influence governments in Central Asia. The British government also harbored fears that Russia planned to move on India, and worried that if the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Russia's dominance of the East would upset the post-war Napoleonic balance of powers. In other words, the British were committed to keeping Turkey around as a check against Russia, and even supported that by pushing the Ottomans into a reform program meant to strengthen the state. But Britain's...
See, so many of the things that are the mindset of the great powers of the 19th century are no different than the mindset of the great powers of the 20th and the 21st century. Constantly thinking about balance of power, about checking great powers so that they don't get too powerful, about using smaller nations as proxies for your wars, for your conflicts, about worrying about the resources in those nations and how you can manipulate the leadership there. Really, not a lot has changed.
Biggest worry were Russian naval bases in Crimea. Using them, Russia could launch a strike against Istanbul before France or Britain could dispatch a fleet to defend it, effectively collapsing the Ottoman state at will. By contrast, on the other side of this religious issue was Napoleon III, who'd been elected the first president of France in 1848. However, then in 1852 he'd lost the election and instead of conceding, just declared himself emperor. However, his coup was on shaky ground and depended heavily on the support of traditional Catholics. So, in an attempt to mollify this political bloc and bring France back to its international standing, he dispatched a famously confrontational diplomat to the Ottoman court in order to insist that a 1740 treaty granted France the right to govern holy sites.
And it's interesting to see Napoleon III using religion as a way of stabilizing his own regime, because Napoleon I did something similar when he came to power. He restored the Catholic Church in many ways in France, where it had been driven out of any kind of influence and power. Not because he was a staunch Catholic who believed in it, but because he understood the importance of the Catholic Church to the people, and therefore could use it as a way of controlling the people, of keeping them happy, by pacifying them, by giving them some things that they wanted.
Then, when the Ottomans agreed with France, an equally inflammatory Russian ambassador countered with a claim based on treaties they claimed nullified that 1740 treaty. So now the Ottomans, fearing Russia might actually declare war, switched their position and granted them the holy sites. Not ready to back down and to prove a point, France then dispatched the 80-gun warship Charlemagne to sail into the Black Sea. A clear violation of treaties that stated warships could not do this in peacetime. Unable to resist this act of gunboat diplomacy, the Ottomans then switched their position again, renaming France the protector of the holy sites, to which Russia responded with invasion. In July 1853, Russian troops surged across the Danube, occupying the territories of Wallachia and Moldavia, which were jointly governed by Russia and the Ottomans.
Romania
and
today.
At this point, Nicholas considered the war as good as over, certain that Britain and France would not support the Turks against fellow Europeans. He was wrong again.
And again, I see the parallels here where somebody underestimates the willingness of potential opposition to go to bat for the nations that they're invading. Russia doesn't think France and Britain will go so far as to go to war with them over something like this. I think probably Hitler felt that way about Poland. I don't think he fully expected that France and Britain would go to war over Poland, because they hadn't over Austria or Czechoslovakia. I think maybe part of Germany thought that they could march through Belgium in World War I and it wouldn't bring the British into the war. A lot of times these wars escalate because you underestimate your potential opponent.
Again. On October 16th, the Ottomans, with the support of Britain and France, declared war on Russia. World War I had begun, and we'll get into all those details next week.
All right, let's go ahead and dive right into episode 2, and we'll pick up where we left off here.
Sinop, Ottoman Empire, November 30th, 1853. Admiral Osman Pasha involuntarily ducks as the shell screams overhead, feeling his insides vibrate as it detonates. Hot iron tears into the sails and decking of the frigate next to his flagship, while men scream for water, carrying buckets to put out the fires the shells have started. They're cut down by shrapnel from the next volley. He's heard about these guns. Cannons that fire explosive shells rather than the solid cannonballs his fleet is equipped with. Their use is still militarily controversial, but it seems the Russian Navy has clearly decided that they are the future, and Osman Pasha's fleet is the first to experience that future.
So it's strange to think that exploding shells would be viewed this way, but very often when new and more destructive technology comes on the scene, the side that is the victim of that technology will argue that it's tantamount to a war crime, even though war crimes aren't really kind of a thing yet in terms of that use of that idea. World War I, for example, the Germans complained about the use of shotguns in the trenches. The Germans, the same Germans who started first using gas, now both sides are using gas by that point, were complaining about shotguns. So that doesn't surprise me a bit.
Limping from a shrapnel wound in his foot, he orders his flagship to run aground so it will not sink. His fleet, much of the Empire's naval power, lies burning, and yet the Russians continue to fire. Thanks so much to Brilliant for helping us tell today's historic tale. When Tsar Nicholas I sent his troops across the Danube and into Ottoman territory, he was sure that the European nations wouldn't come to the Ottomans' defense. And honestly, he had good reason to believe that. Back in 1844, he'd personally met with the British government and signed a secret memo between the two, agreeing on a partition of the Ottoman Empire were it to fall. because they were both alarmed by the French economic and colonial expansion into the Middle East, and he'd raised this agreement with the British in the days leading up to the outbreak of war.
So think of World War II when you have the Germans and the Russians, the Soviets, agreeing to divide up Poland. And it's like, all right, we're going to invade from this side, we're going to invade from this side, you'll get part, we'll get part. I think Tsar Nicholas is thinking kind of the same thing here, is that the British and the Russians can kind of divvy up the Ottomans. And so if the Russians go first, they can be viewed as the bad guy. And then the British can very quietly come in and take some territory of their own. Didn't work out that way.
And the British didn't intervene, at first. While Britain and France had expressed private support to the Ottomans at the outset of the war, their first actions when the fighting started was to hold a conference between Britain, France, Prussia, and Austria to create a diplomatic solution acceptable to all parties. Now, this was how the Concert of Europe had been designed in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, gathering to resolve disputes via diplomacy rather than combat.
This is an early precursor to the League of Nations and then the United Nations. The Congress of Vienna, which we've covered extensively from Historia Civilis' fantastic series on all of that, trying to avoid another set of Napoleonic wars, trying to avoid situations like this from spiraling out of control.
And while they debated, they insisted Russia could defend its territory, but take no aggressive actions. This time, however, the Concert of Europe failed. Ottoman Sultan Abdülmecid I rejected their initial peace proposal as too beneficial to Russia, and then when they rewrote it, Russia rejected it as too slanted toward the Ottomans. And truth be told, not all of these governments really wanted to broaden this conflict. For example, Britain's ruling party would rather the Ottomans defend themselves, and the Ottomans worried that if the French and British had to save them, it would open the door for these stronger allies to push them around as junior partners. But the Battle of Sinop changed all that.
And you might look at that and think, well, wouldn't you want help if you need it? But this is a common concern. When the Americans were fighting their revolution to break away from the British, there were those who rejected the idea of reaching out to the European powers for help because they were afraid that, well, we're going to just trade being servants of the British for being servants of France or the Netherlands or Spain, even though they had to have that help in order to win.
Not only had Russia taken the aggressive action the concert had forbid, its new dominance of the Black Sea was seen as a challenge to British and French naval power. Increasingly, Britain thought, war might be necessary to prop up the Ottomans, lest Russia consume it, upsetting the balance of power. And while Nicholas didn't see this coming, truth be told, he didn't fully grasp how Britain functioned. As an autocrat who never bothered studying other governments, he didn't get the role opposition parties and public opinion could play in shifting policy. To him, he'd spoken with the British royals and their political leaders, set out a mutual plan, and that was going to be it, right?
This is why you have to study history. If you have any intention of being in any kind of leadership position, study history, study politics. You've got to know how your opponent operates. If you just assume that, well, I talked to the king, or the queen in this case, Queen Victoria, and her people, and they assured me there's nothing to it, that don't mean nothing if they're not the ones running the show.
But what he underestimated most of all was the free press, which revealed itself as a far more potent weapon than the explosive shells used at Sinop. British and French newspapers cast the Russian victory at Sinop as a massacre, quoting a British witness who claimed that the Russian fleet continued to fire, even when the Ottoman ships could no longer fire back. Though this was a pretty common practice in naval warfare, the virulently Russophobic British press, already known for printing conspiracy theories about Russian plans to dominate Europe, made it a celebrated cause. And of course...
So this makes me think of the Spanish-American War in 1898, how journalism played a major factor in getting people behind that and even pushing the government toward the idea of war. And what's one of the things you need to do in order to get your people behind a cause? You've got to paint your potential enemy as the bad guy. Now it's no longer two warring sides and we're kind of a neutral third party. It's look at big bad Russia and how they're treating these weak, defenseless Ottomans, and they're massacring their people. We've got to intervene. This is a humanitarian issue now.
Sinop was exactly the kind of aggressive action Russia had been warned against. Public opinion swung toward the war party in Parliament, and after Russia ignored a British and French ultimatum to withdraw from Ottoman territory, the two declared war on March 28, 1854. Again, the press was decisive. In previous wars, recruiters would have to entice men to enlist by offering upfront bonuses, but now newspapers largely did the work of whipping up nationalistic fervor and trumpeting the glories to be found on the battlefield. Yeah. So across the UK, young men flocked to sign up for adventure, leaving their villages and cities in smart uniforms and singing lighthearted songs. However, the Royal Navy was already engaged in the conflict. Before joining the war, the British and French fleets had moved into Turkish waters and then the Black Sea in order to serve as a deterrent. But it was in the Baltic Sea that they struck the first blow. A massive Anglo-French fleet hit the Baltic in April, and within days was in sight of the Russian capital of St. Petersburg. However, after trying the fortress protecting it, and finding its defenses too formidable, the fleet decided instead to destroy the smaller fortresses and ports around the Baltic, burning supplies and threatening the capital, so Russia was forced to retain a large army in the area rather than sending it south. The Russian Baltic...
Pretty smart. You inflict enough damage without risking yourself too much. Because you've got a navy, Russia's got a massive army. Use your strength and do enough to pin his massive army in place with the threat of something worse without risking too much. Pretty smart.
Fleet, terrified of this larger force, mostly huddled around the shore batteries near St. Petersburg, relying instead on their new invention of sea mines to damage their enemies. Now, it's important to remember that this campaign effectively won the war. The Allies had bottled up Russia's Baltic fleet, tied down huge numbers of troops, and instituted an economic blockade that would, more than anything, force the Russians to eventually sue for peace.
This is always the British at their best with their navy. Economic blockades. It worked against Napoleon. It forced Napoleon into his war against Russia that ultimately led to his downfall. It is what is one of the primary causes not only of bringing the Germans down in World War I, it's also what leads to the Germans taking action that leads to the United States entering World War I.
And better still, they'd done it with few casualties on either side. So they were considered heroes, right? Oh, they weren't? Oh man. In fact, the British press printed scathing articles that mocked the Allied commanders and accused them of cowardice for not attacking St. Petersburg.
Live by the sword, die by the sword. The very same press that got you into the war in the first place is now going to be the cause for you making bad decisions.
And this lack of major battles ensured that the Baltic campaign would go largely unremembered, while the less strategically vital battles on the Black Sea would become enshrined in stories and poems due to the heroic amounts of bloodshed. Yet at the same time, the most consequential land battle of the war was going on, and the public largely didn't know it. In May of 1854, Russian forces drove south toward Constantinople. Knowing that the Allies were on their way, but had not yet deployed in force, they aimed to take the Ottoman capital and bring the war to a speedy conclusion. But in their way was the Ottoman fortress of Silistra in what is now Bulgaria. With the French and British still marshalling their forces, unable to help, a force that eventually numbered 90,000 Russians besieged the 15,000 Ottoman soldiers in the fortress. The garrison were mostly Egyptians and Albanians, supported by a half-dozen British advisors that took command when the Ottoman general was killed by a shell, his blood splattering the prayer mat where he'd been making his devotions. For a month and a half, the Russian army pounded Silistra. Inside, it was hell. But from a bluff, largely outside the line of fire, a young Russian artilleryman watched. June 21st, 1854, just outside Silistra. The artilleryman looks on enthralled as the faraway men kill each other. A young count, he had gambled away his fortune and joined the army to avoid his creditors. And while he enjoyed the action of military life, he thought that perhaps writing was the path for him. That's what he mostly does at Silistra anyway. Stands on the bluffs, watching the battle, reflecting how strangely entertaining it is, and how oddly beautiful the night becomes, as shells burst and cannons stab orange into the darkness.
Some of the darkest moments, Leo Tolstoy, some of the darkest moments of human experience lead to some of our most beautiful expressions of art. Not only paintings, but poetry, books, Just was talking to somebody about that just this morning, about all the beautiful poetry that came out of the First World War. Men trying to give a voice to these horrible experiences that they were having. And Tolstoy's going to do the same thing.
His name is Leo Tolstoy, and his impressions of this war will bring him unprecedented literary success and create one of the greatest novels of all time.
Yep.
However, now, here, he's thinking of battle. Soon, they will storm the fortress in their final attack. Oh, what will he witness? Will he live? And if so, how will he describe it in his letters? Suddenly, their officer shouts. He has new orders. Limber up the guns. We're marching back north. But why? Why now? Tolstoy asks. Aren't they finally about to win? It's an order directly from Tsar Nicholas. Turns out, Austria has ceased its neutrality and massed 250,000 troops along their border. They intend to rush into the Russian-occupied Balkans and Danube region, pushing the Tsarist forces out unless the Russians leave peacefully. That territory will now be occupied by a joint Austrian-Ottoman force. Given that the British and French have landed 70,000 troops at Varna, the Russians can't win. So, to avoid them being trapped between two forces, the Tsar has pulled them out. The drive towards Constantinople has been cancelled, not by battle, but by maneuver and diplomatic threat. Tolstoy writes of his disappointment, but in truth, he need not fret for long, for he will see combat soon enough in the bloodiest theater of the conflict, a gory and grinding battle on a peninsula that will give the war its name, Crimea. You know, Zoe, there is...
All right. Interesting stuff. Fascinating. Hopefully this inspires you to want to learn more, as it certainly is for me, about this very forgotten major war in world history. So we'll pick up right where we left off tomorrow with the next episode. If you are a patron or a member, by the time this video goes live for the public, the next episodes will be available for you to be able to see right away. So check those out. Thanks for watching.